My emotions! My emotions!
Stop me if you heard this one before. Let's say you just finished an amazing movie or series, and the first thing you do is tell all your friends about it. Most of them will probably have a wide range of opinions, but there's always that one friend who'll say, I don't know, I think the book was better. And while that discussion may differ depending on the book and adaptation in question, it's a statement that illustrates the strengths and weaknesses between different mediums. Books have the advantage of being longer and more detailed, while visual mediums, like movies and TV, can bring those words to life through imagery, performances, and music. But even the best adaptations lose something in the transition, and it's difficult to capture the full depth of a story and elevate that story with powerful visuals and music. It's difficult, but definitely not impossible, especially if you look beyond the realm of books and movies. For many, the term visual novel might raise a few eyebrows, and that's mostly because they're by and large a fairly niche medium in the West. The medium can be traced back to the 1980s with a title known as the Protopia Serial Murder Case, a Famicom game about, well, a serial murder. But visual novels wouldn't really take off until the following decades, and ever since that initial boom, they've remained a mainstay of the Japanese media landscape. And even though VNs haven't had the same popularity in the West, they have been gaining traction over time. Nowadays, it's getting easier for the average Westerner to buy and read VNs, and many Western devs have made their mark on the scene with VNs of their own. It's a great time to be a fan of visual novels, and even though the fanbase is small, we're dedicated, and there's no better time to check out the medium for yourself. As for what visual novels are, they're exactly what it says on the tin. In short, VNs are interactive mediums that feature visuals alongside text, and a good comparison would be something like, say, Disco Elysium. While Disco Elysium is a video game, there's actually not much gameplay to speak of. Most of the game involves you, the player, picking various dialogue options and reading the story as it unfolds. And at the most basic level, that's exactly what a VN experience is, a novel with visual elements. Surprising, I know. But visual novels aren't just glorified picture books. The medium is incredibly vast, and many of the great ones take the best parts of other mediums and merge them into a single, sublime package. A truly great VN will have a rich story, jaw-dropping visuals, and music that hits you right in your soul, which makes for an experience unlike any other. As for me personally, I think I made my opinions on VNs quite clear over time. I first got into VNs sometime back in the mid-2000s, with a novel that we'll get to soon enough. But I wouldn't really get into VNs until the next decade, when I read through a little-known novel known as Fate Stay Night. Maybe you've heard of it. But ever since I saw the credits roll, that was when everything fell into place. Nowadays, I wouldn't consider myself a VN connoisseur, but I'm absolutely a fan of the medium, and I treat VNs like any other piece of media. I might not always go looking for VNs to read, but if there's one that looks interesting, I'm more than happy to give it a chance. And more than anything, that's my main goal with a video like this. I don't expect to get viewers hooked on VNs, but I think that the medium has a lot to offer, especially if you're someone who just likes good storytelling. For example, story-based RPGs are a cornerstone of the gaming industry, and when you look at visual novels and RPGs, they're actually very similar at their core. Remember the Protopia Serial Murder Case? As it turns out, the creator of that novel is Yuji Horii, the same person who would go on to create the very first Dragon Quest. In a way, a visual novel is the reason we have JRPG titans like Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy. And if you love a good RPG story, you'll feel right at home with VNs. But that gets into a minor dilemma with the medium. Telling someone to read a visual novel is like sending a kid to the library all by themselves, and it's easy to get lost in the vast ocean of genres and developers. As such, my other goal for this video is to get prospective readers a guide of sorts. That way you have a broad idea of what kind of stories are out there. When it comes to visual novels, it's easy to assume that they're all the same, like dating sims or slice of life stories. And while those novels do make up a decent chunk of the market, it's not really fair to judge an entire medium based on that. That's like saying every book is like 50 Shades of Grey, and we all know that's not true at all. Much like actual books, visual novels can vary in terms of style and genre, and if you're willing to look around, chances are you'll find one that piques your interest. Whether you want a fantasy adventure, an intense drama, or dark mystery, there's definitely a little something for everyone. It's no secret that visuals are often a VN's main selling point, and more often than not, the visuals will be the first thing to catch your interest. Like any visual medium, the visuals in a visual novel are essential in everything from setting the tone and atmosphere, establishing each character's personality, and adding weight to the story's biggest moments, all of which elevate the story being told. But the visuals themselves can vary quite a bit from novel to novel, and it all depends on the artist, genre, developer, and like a million other factors. For example, the most common style you'll see are visuals similar to something you'd see in anime, like bright and expressive character designs. Something like this helps give the story a sense of familiarity, and when it comes to something more slice of life focused, something vibrant and expressive helps create a more gentle, comfy atmosphere. But in contrast, other novels may choose a different kind of art direction, like something more stylized, or focus on specific colors or designs. In turn, this gives the story a completely different kind of feel and atmosphere, all of which is used to great effect in many novels. And in some cases, there's many novels that actually use an art style to set a certain tone, only for the story to turn everything on its head when the time is right. And this creates a really cool juxtaposition, where you have something like cutesy anime designs, but an absolutely horrifying story, which makes for a very unique kind of experience. They say you shouldn't judge a book by its cover, and on a similar note, you definitely shouldn't judge a visual novel by its art either. For every novel with a basic art style, there's another with a radically unique one, and it's all a matter of being open-minded to the medium as a whole. And beyond a novel's art style and direction, the visuals are often used to add impact to a story's key moments. In visual novels, these typically come in the form of CGs, and they generally refer to the more cinematic art you see in a novel. CGs are where you can see the true skill of the artist at hand, and more often than not, the CGs are where you'll see and feel the full weight of the story. A picture is worth 1,000 words, and visual novels have the best of both worlds. But visual novels aren't just a series of static images either. While static sprites and backgrounds were common in older VNs, the medium has evolved to include enhanced visuals of all sorts, like motion and special effects. The kind of visuals you'll see depend on the novel, genre, and limitations of the time, and in a lot of older novels, the most you'll see are things like fight scenes with a bit more pageantry. But when you fast forward to newer novels, the visuals and effects are downright immaculate, and the medium will only continue to evolve. But the gist of this section is honestly a really simple one, and it's that at heart, the visuals in a visual novel are an essential part of the whole package. While I enjoy reading and listening to books, I also like having visuals to help capture the essence of a story, and that's where visual novels excel. And whenever a visual novel reaches its high points, you'll be treated to scenes that are not only gorgeous, but deeply impactful as well. I can think of so many moments where the visuals alone stayed with me, and whenever I reread one of my favorites, those moments hit just as hard as they did the very first time. But as the name of the medium suggests, visuals are only one half of the package, which leads us to the next part, the written word of the novels. While visuals are often a VN's main draw at first, they are still novels that must be read, and most of your experience of the VN will be reading text like a normal book. And the benefits of this are honestly really straightforward, as the biggest edge a book has over a movie or film is the sheer amount of content. Most adaptations typically have limited runtimes, and they often have to make compromises for the greater good, like cutting storylines, characters, or lore. But visual novels don't have this restriction, and a writer is able to explore their story in as much or as little detail as possible. For the most part, this is generally a good thing, as many VNs have the kind of lore and world building you'd see in, say, a long-running fantasy or sci-fi series. And in addition to world building, a VN's length means that many characters get explored very thoroughly, whether it's through backstory, character progression, or their dynamics with other characters. But none of this is unique to the visual novel medium, and you could say the same things about any good book. But what really sets VNs apart is how the reading is broken up, and it's usually done through interactivity. Visual novels exist on the spectrum between books, movies and TV, and video games, and similar to video games, most VNs rely on your input as the reader and player. Now, interactivity in VNs can come in many shapes and styles, all of which depend on the novel in question. The most common examples are in the form of choices, which are moments in the story where you decide on what a character says or does. In some cases, these choices are fairly minor, as the most you'll get are new bits of lore or unique character interactions. But there are many cases where certain choices can drastically change the story, similar to a choose-your-own adventure book. If you're a dinosaur like me, chances are you're familiar with these kind of books, but the way they work is that readers are presented with various choices throughout the story. Some choices lead to other outcomes, while others can lead to premature endings. Visual novels are very similar in this regard, and the most notable example of choices affecting a story come in the form of routes. Routes refers to the different paths a story can take, and the way routes unfold differ drastically depending on the novel in question. The most common examples are how routes are usually tied to certain characters, with each route placing a special focus on them or their relationship to the main character. But like I keep saying, the way each novel handles routes depends on the novel in question and how the author wants to tell the story. Sometimes, routes function as individual stories with a beginning, middle, and end, and some novels present many stories as opposed to just one. But there are also many examples where a novel uses routes as part of one greater story, with each route giving you more pieces to the overall puzzle. Some novels even do both, as they have a combination of individual stories and individual stories that build into one complete story. There's a lot of variation in how visual novels use the structure of choices and routes, and while other mediums have attempted something similar, not many have come quite close to how VNs do it. And even though choices and routes are the most common forms of interactivity, the type of interactivity can vary dramatically depending on the novel. Some novels function like point-and-click style games, others use minigames, and you'll often see many different styles all at once. Every novel or series does something a little differently, and even though VNs can seem like walls of text at times, that experience is broken up in many ways. And even though interactivity is a central aspect of the medium, some VNs don't even have choices, and they function much more like a normal book. There are VNs for those who like reading, and VNs for those who like more interactivity, and at the risk of sounding like a broken record, it really just depends on the novel in question. But beyond the visual and novel aspects of visual novels, the final element of the medium isn't as obvious, but it's important nonetheless, which is sound and sound design. While VNs have both visuals and the written word, many VNs feature full voice acting, which breathes life into the words you see on screen. But that said, it should be noted that full voice acting isn't always a given, and it's more common in established companies as opposed to smaller dev teams. But that leads me to the next feature of visual novels, and in my opinion, it's a medium's true ace in the hole: music. When it comes to most visual mediums, music is an essential aspect of the experience. It can elevate a story when it's good, and take it to the stratosphere when it's amazing, and many VN devs understand that lesson very well. When it comes to music in VNs, the only negatives I've encountered are music that's either repetitive or just kind of okay, and even those soundtracks have at least one banger, if not several. But more often than not, visual novel music ranges from good to incredible, not to mention the sheer range of music within the medium. Every novel does something unique with how they approach the music, and you see everything from 80s style synth, something classical and orchestral, and just about anything and everything in between. And beyond the visuals and text, the music is what really highlights the feelings and emotions of a scene, whether it's something calm and gentle, something heart-wrenching, or some of the hypest, most action-packed moments of the story. One of my favorite things about reading a new VN is checking out the soundtrack, and there's even been many times where I stumbled on a VN's music first, and bought the novel later because the music was just that good. And to give you an extreme example, I love VN music so much, my wife and I were very close to having our violinist play VN music at our wedding. It was between music from these two, by the way. We settled on Fire Emblem music instead, and it was amazing, but still. If that's not a shining endorsement of something, I don't know what is. So when you put everything together, you can see how the VN medium is so much more than a novel with pictures. Visual novels lie in this nexus between books, movies and TV, and video games, and when a VN is firing on all cylinders, it actually takes the best parts of each medium without many compromises. Many of the best visual novels have breathtaking visuals, an in-depth story, and strong reader engagement, and it's all tied together with sublime music. Like, imagine if you could experience Lord of the Rings, but with a full cast voicing every character, the orchestral music playing as you read, and the full, unabridged text of the novel. If you ask me, that's a pretty sweet deal, and you couldn't ask for more in a medium. But now that we've explored what visual novels are, next comes the really fun part, VN recommendations. The world of visual novels can feel vast, alien, and intimidating, and even if I had all the time in the world, there's simply no way to explore every novel and genre in detail. As such, I compiled a list of 9 recommendations, 7 visual novels I wholeheartedly recommend, and 2 honorable mentions. And when I say honorable mention, that's not an indicator of quality by any means. I have high praise for every upcoming novel, and the honorable mentions are only labeled as such because of minor notes. And it should be noted that my recommendations are far from perfect. Like most readers, there are some genres I gravitate to more than others, and that means there's going to be some blind spots. My aim is to simply give prospective readers a bit of a head start, and I hope you can take these recommendations and use that as a springboard for your own research. Next, and this should be a fairly obvious note, but spoilers will be kept to a minimum moving forward. I'll explain the basic premises, but there are many novels where the less you know, the better, so I'll do my best to honor that. And on a related note, there is a subject of length and time investment. While I praise the medium for its storytelling depth, that aspect can be a double-edged sword in the wrong circumstances, and there are many examples where VNs can feel like they take ages to get going. Slow burns aren't a bad thing, but on a first read-through, it's hard to gauge what a story is building to, and if the payoff is worth what it takes to get there. As such, a fair compromise is something I'll call a vibe check, which are my recommended stopping points where readers can pause and assess how they feel about the novel, hence the name. There's only 4 upcoming novels where a vibe check is relevant, but I feel it's important so you understand why a story is written the way it is. If you feel like a novel still isn't for you, that's fine, but I do hope you have the patience to read as much as you can. And as a final note, I'll be sure to include any additional notes below, like notes on each novel I mention, where to buy them, and most importantly, details on the novels I couldn't address here. I used a lot of VNs for B-roll throughout this video, and even though I would have liked to include many of them in the full discussion, I couldn't, or else this video would easily spiral out of control. But I did still want to mention them in one way or another, so if there's something that wasn't included in the main discussion, I'll be sure to address it below. And with all that out of the way, we can finally move on to the visual novels in question, and I'll start with the first honorable mention on the list, 13 Sentinels, Aegis Rim. In the far future, humanity is at war with time-traveling aliens, and in order to combat them, humans develop giant mechs known as Sentinels. The story chronicles humanity's war across time, ranging from World War II, 1985, and even the far future, as they fight for their very survival. As you may have inferred from the title, 13 Sentinels follows the 13 pilots of each mech, all of whom come from different points in history. This novel is effectively one story told in 13 parts, with each thread intertwining depending on the scenario. And this gives the story a lot of variance in terms of plot lines and characters, as each storyline feels distinct, but still relevant to the greater story being told. This novel is everything from 80s style adventure elements, time loops, romance, mysteries, and much more. And not only does it all work, but that doesn't even begin to cover the real story. Seriously, you think the Nasuverse is complicated? I don't even think I could explain this story off the top of my head if I tried. 13 Sentinels is easily one of the most inventive sci-fi stories I've ever read, and watching how the plot evolved was something I won't forget anytime soon. As for the reason why it's an honorable mention, it's honestly down to semantics. 13 Sentinels is unique compared to other novels in that it has actual, honest-to-god gameplay, and for that reason, there's some debate as to whether it's a true VN. In short, 13 Sentinels is broken up into 2 halves, Destruction segments, which are RTS battle sections, and Remembrance segments, which are text-driven story sections. Since most of the appeal lies in the Remembrance segments, I personally think it's more VN than video game, but it's just splitting hairs. At the end of the day, a good story is a good story, and 13 Sentinels is one good-ass story. If you're a fan of sci-fi, do yourself a favor and check out this novel. You definitely won't regret it. But as complicated and convoluted as a previous novel can be, it's nothing compared to the next, and final, honorable mention. Umineko When They Cry. Umineko revolves around the events that took place on October 4th, 1986, on an island known as Rokkenjima. The island is owned by a very wealthy family, all of whom gathered together to discuss various affairs. But that fateful evening, tragedy struck, and the following morning, members of the family awoke to find some of their loved ones brutally murdered. The culprit is unknown, and the only clues are each survivor's motivation, the occult-like nature of the murders, and the legend of someone known as the Golden Witch, who's said to be behind the family's incredible fortune. And it's up to one member of the family, Battler, to solve the mysteries behind the massacre. Now, there's a chance you heard the synopsis and thought it sounded familiar, and if so, you're right on the money. Umineko is a murder mystery in the style of a classic whodunit, with the most obvious inspiration being Agatha Christie's And Then There Were None. Umineko's basic structure is similar to what you'd see in a classic detective story, and if you're a fan of whodunits, you'll see many familiar tropes and concepts. But not for long. What sets Umineko apart is how it adds to the whodunit formula, and how it subverts and plays with the mystery genre. While Umineko was inspired by classic mystery novels, it was also inspired by works such as Dante's Divine Comedy, and that's the most I'll say about that. And Umineko also differs in how it aims to be a different kind of mystery. While Umineko is a mystery novel, it's also a character drama that explores a very flawed, very complicated family, and that drama is just as essential as the mysteries. The novel isn't just a series of logic puzzles waiting to be solved, and if you don't have the capacity for love and understanding, the real heart of the story will never be seen. And all of this is what makes Umineko so unique, and it barely scratches the surface of everything the novel explores. Umineko is both a love letter to classic mysteries and something else entirely, and it's easily one of the most ambitious, most creative stories I've read in ages. Having said that, Umineko does have one major roadblock, and it's the reason it's an honorable mention: the length. Umineko is the longest novel on this list by a long shot, and even fast readers can expect to spend anywhere from 80 to 100 hours finishing it. And when it comes to the story's length, I'm of two minds about it. See, Umineko is split into 8 episodes, and each episode is structured in a way to build on the last. For example, episode 1 is structured like a classic whodunit, while episodes 2 and 3 add to that premise in creative ways. The multi-episode format adds to the story from both a narrative and thematic standpoint, and it's one of my favorite aspects of Umineko. However, Umineko is definitely too much of a good thing. Bloat is by far the biggest issue with this novel, and even as someone who likes Umineko, I also think you could trim like a third of each episode, and the core story would be just as strong, if not stronger. As much as I praise and recommend Umineko, the time investment is a lot to ask, especially if you're a VN newbie. Recommending Umineko isn't so much like throwing someone in the deep end, but more like chucking them in the damn ocean, and it's not the kind of story for everyone. But having said all of that, I do think Umineko's artistic merits outweigh the flaws. My aim with this section isn't so much to recommend Umineko, but to at least bring attention to it for when the time is right. I actually knew about Umineko for about a decade before I read it, and even though I was initially put off by the time investment, I can now say I'm very glad I did read it. It might not be the kind of story worth checking out right away, but someday it might be worth your consideration. And if you're willing to give Umineko a chance, I will say that a good vibe check is around the end of episode 1. Episode 1 takes some time to get going, but it does set the foundation that later episodes build from, and if you're at least a little intrigued by what you read, there's a good chance you'll enjoy the later episodes. And I sincerely hope you do enjoy the story. A lot of great stories have a way of lingering with you one way or another, and even when I finished Umineko, I wasn't sure if I liked everything I read. But as time went on, I kept thinking about aspects like the phenomenal character writing, the way the clues are hidden, or the way the novel engages with the player. Umineko isn't driven by player choices like a normal VN, and instead, much of the engagement comes from how you choose to interact with the story. As you read Umineko, it becomes apparent that the author is practically begging you to solve every puzzle, and if you're willing to put in the effort, you definitely can. If you're the kind of reader who likes to analyze and overanalyze a story, this is your novel, and I promise you the author wrote Umineko for readers like you. But after the honorable mentions, we have my genuine recommendations, and to start off, we have a novel, or rather, novels I have a lot of nostalgia for. Phoenix Wright, Ace Attorney Trilogy. Ace Attorney has you follow up-and-coming defense attorney Phoenix Wright, as he attempts to uphold justice and defend the innocent. And joining Phoenix are a host of other wacky characters, including, but not limited to, his psychic sidekick, his best frenemy, and many, many eccentric prosecutors. As far as the novel itself, Ace Attorney is generally structured by cases, all of which include an intro, an investigation, and a trial. While the intros are self-explanatory, the investigation segments have Phoenix explore crime scenes, interview witnesses, and search every nook and cranny for clues. And once the investigation is finished, it's trial time, where Phoenix has to find contradictions, press witnesses, and do everything he can to prove his client's innocence. But even though the general formula of Ace Attorney doesn't change very much, where the series excels is through its charming writing. Trials and crime scenes aren't exactly the lightest subject matter, but the characters are all funny and likable, and they add some much needed levity to something that would otherwise feel very heavy. And even though Ace Attorney is generally pretty lighthearted, the series isn't afraid to have strong emotional beats when the story calls for it. Heart and humor is the bread and butter of Ace Attorney, and that's exactly why fans everywhere fell in love with the series. As for me personally, Ace Attorney is a series I always feel a certain fondness for, as it was the very first visual novel I ever read. And I loved the first entry so much, I read what I could around the time and even tried to main Phoenix in MVC 3. I was really bad with him, but that's beside the point. But nowadays, the series is as popular as ever, and there's no better time to see what the hype is about. Now, the Ace Attorney trilogy includes the original Ace Attorney, its sequel, Justice for All, and the third entry, Trials and Tribulations, and it's worth checking out for anyone looking for something light and quirky. I had a blast reading Ace Attorney years ago, and I have fun rereading it now, and I can only hope you'll feel the same if you decide to check it out. But coming after Ace Attorney is something a little different. 999, which stands for 9 hours, 9 persons, 9 doors. 999 has you follow Junpei, a normal young man caught in a strange circumstance. Junpei wakes up to find himself trapped on a boat with 9 individuals, and according to a mysterious person known as Zero, the boat is set to sink in 9 hours. The group's only hope lies in a door with a 9 on it, which should, in theory, provide an escape. But in order to reach that door, the group must work together and solve various puzzles, all while attempting to solve the mystery of who Zero is and what their motives are. While 999 is mostly text-driven like your average VN, what sets it apart are the various puzzle segments throughout the novel. Most sections are broken up through escape room style scenarios, where Junpei and the gang need to find clues, objects, and keys in order to move to the next area. Each puzzle isn't too difficult, but there's a lot of creative scenarios, and you are encouraged to rack your brain and think outside the box. And when you combine the puzzle sections with the main narrative, you end up with something that's equal parts inventive, thrilling, and exceptionally engaging. I won't say too much about the main story, but I will say it's one that draws you in from the beginning, and only keeps ramping up in ways you never expect. This novel is a true roller coaster from start to finish, and even when you see the credits roll the first time, things are only just getting started. 999 takes full advantage of the VN medium, and if you're looking for a thrilling, darker kind of story, I couldn't recommend this novel enough. But coming after 999 is something a little different. Slay the Princess. As far as the premise, it's relatively straightforward, and I'll let the narrator himself explain.
You're on a path in the woods, and at the end of that path is a cabin. And in the basement of that cabin is a princess. You're here to slay her. If you don't, it will be the end of the world.
Now, this is one of those novels where the less you know, the better, but what I will say is that this novel feels similar to games like the Stanley Parable and Disco Elysium. There's a huge emphasis on player choice and interactivity, and a key part of the story is how those choices affect yourself and the titular princess. But what's remarkable about this novel is how it's able to balance all its moving parts. Slay the Princess may be a horror novel, but it's woven together with a good sense of humor and genuine warmth and earnestness when the story calls for it. One part may feel gruesome and violent, while the next feels like a dark romance, and there are many times where the story will shift in ways you expect, only to switch gears and catch you off guard. And this should be fairly obvious given the visuals, but the general aesthetic and atmosphere of the novel are also massive selling points. The visuals are hand-drawn with pencil, which gives the novel a wonderfully expressive style unlike any other. And when you add in the incredible voice acting and music, baby, you've got a stew going. I know the synopsis was very brief, but like I said earlier, this is another one where it helps to know as little as possible. But what I can say is that Slay the Princess is definitely worth your time. If you're looking for a story that balances comedy, horror, and emotional depth, give Slay the Princess a chance. It's one of the most unique novels I've read in some time, and I can't wait to see everything else it has to offer. And now, we shift away from darker novels into something a little more cozy. Valhalla, cyberpunk bartender action. The year is 2070X, an era where dogs can speak, cybernetic enhancements are widely available, and androids are as common as flesh and blood humans. But the more things change, the more they stay the same, which brings us to Glitch City and a hole-in-the-wall bar known as Valhalla. The novel has you follow Jill Stingray, a bartender at Valhalla, as she does exactly what you expect of her job description. Valhalla is unique compared to other novels in that there aren't any dialogue choices, and instead, the novel is driven by what you serve each customer. Every customer at Valhalla has their own likes and dislikes, and if you wish, you can serve them exactly what they ask for. But part of being a good bartender is tending to the customer's needs, like serving a drink they might like better, or, in most cases, the kind of drink they need right now. It's a simple formula, but one that offers many possibilities depending on the customer and scenario. Maybe one drink option will reveal something new about the world, or a character's backstory, and if you really want to have fun, you can choose to get someone absolutely plastered, which leads to all sorts of fun shenanigans. And overall, the fact that there's so much going on with such a small-scale novel is where Valhalla truly shines. This novel is like getting a peek at a much bigger, more complicated world, complete with inhabitants that are just as fascinating and complicated, like the local law enforcement, the bar's eccentric owner, and perhaps my favorite of all, the hot mess that is the bartender. I've read quite a few VNs over the years, and while Valhalla might not be my absolute favorite, it might actually be my go-to comfort novel. This novel is basically the word vibe personified, and even though the art style and music help create that vibe, what really ties it together is the world building and character writing. Valhalla might not have the most bombastic story around, but it doesn't need one, and those small, day-to-day interactions can be just as profound and meaningful. I adore this novel. I mean, come on, look at this. I don't even buy plushies for myself. If you're interested in something with great world building, solid character writing, or just want something cozy and relaxing, I couldn't recommend Valhalla enough, and I hope you'll enjoy it as much as I did. But coming after Valhalla, we have another sci-fi novel, and one that's quite a bit more famous, Steins Gate. The story broadly follows the adventures of the Future Gadget Lab and its founder, Okabe. While the name Future Gadget Lab seems very noteworthy, it's really just a fun name for a group of friends, and most inventions made are simply harmless junk. But one day, everyone's lives take a turn when they accidentally create something brilliant, yet terrifying, a time machine. Using a microwave and a cell phone, anyone with a phone can send messages to the past, which leads to ripple effects in the present. The changes start out small at first, but it becomes apparent the group is in way over their heads, and as the situation grows worse and worse, the power of time travel seems more like a curse than a blessing. While Steins Gate feels like a familiar brand of sci-fi, where it excels is in the richness of the finer details, namely the story progression, the roles and world building, and the character writing. Time travel stories are notoriously hard to get right, and it's very common to see things like plot holes and paradoxes in the average time travel story. But this is not the average time travel story, and Steins Gate is written so tightly, it easily succeeds where so many others have failed. And perhaps the single best aspect of the novel is how it gets you invested in the characters. Sci-fi is a genre that tends to be rather cold and emotionless, and this story is not like that in the slightest. You spend a lot of time getting to know everyone, and while every character is a little weird, you'll find that those quirks almost always hide something deeper. It's very easy to judge a character based on a first impression, but the most I can say is be patient, give it time, and they'll eventually grow on you. And speaking of patience, that gets into something that Steins is notorious for, which is the pacing. The novel actually has a very strong prologue, but after that, the story slows to a glacial pace, which can be a major issue for many readers. And I don't say that as a negative by any means, and in fact, I go further in saying that the slower pace is what makes Steins so good. This novel relies on your investment in the characters, and the more time you spend with them, the easier it is to get invested. And the pacing benefits the story as well, as the best way to describe Steins is that it's like a pressure cooker. Everything starts out light and breezy, but the story builds and builds until one moment it hits a crescendo, and once that happens, there's no going back. Could the pacing of Steins be better? Absolutely. But the story we have is already fantastic as is, and there's something beautiful about slow burn storytelling that can't be replicated through other means. The story of Steins is just one example of that, and I wouldn't have it any other way. But the pacing and length of Steins necessitates a vibe check, and this is where it gets tricky. There isn't really a place that works as a decent checkpoint, but I highly recommend reading up to at least chapter 5. That's when the story starts to really pick up, so I encourage you to hold out until then. Steins is already widely beloved, both as an anime and a visual novel, and it's a story that earned its acclaim for a reason. It's a sci-fi story that's truly stood the test of time, no pun intended, and it's worth checking out if you haven't already. And coming off the sci-fi genre, we enter the realm of fantasy and magic with one of my personal favorites, Witch on the Holy Night, otherwise known as Mahoyo. Set in the 1980s, Mahoyo is a story about 3 central characters: a mage in training named Aoko, her housemate and fellow mage Alice, and Sojuro, a normal guy from the mountains. As a normal person, Sojuro lives a very different life compared to the mages, and one fateful evening, these worlds collide when Sojuro sees magic with his own eyes. While that may not sound like a big deal, mages in the Gnostiverse operate in a series of codes and beliefs, one of which being that magic must be hidden from the outside world. And moreover, mages must be cold and calculating, and every decision made should be swift, impartial, and devoid of any emotion whatsoever. Because Sojuro was a witness to magic that involved Aoko and Alice, both of them are responsible for the next course of action, and it's up to them to resolve the problem, and do so in a manner befitting a proper mage. Mahoyo is unique compared to other Type Moon VNs in how simple it is. Unlike Nasu's other works, there are no serial killers, vampires, or legendary heroes, and Mahoyo seems rather muted compared to its peers. But do not assume that makes Mahoyo a lesser story. I've mentioned time and time again that Nasu's greatest strength is his character writing, and that's on full display in this novel. The heart and soul of Mahoyo is with each of his central characters, like what they represent, their dynamics, and how their relationships change over time. Earlier, I mentioned how mages in the Gnostiverse operate on codes and logic, and that's in direct contrast to who we are as humans. You can see this dichotomy in each of Mahoyo's main characters, as each of them represent what it means to be a human, or what it means to be a mage. As an heiress to your prestigious mage family, Alice is the perfect embodiment of a proper mage, and she carries herself in a manner befitting her abilities and background. And on the other side, we have Sojuro, someone who's like the definition of just a guy, until he isn't. And lastly, there's Aoko, who's right in the middle of the spectrum. Like Alice, Aoko also comes from a famous family, but where they differ are their personalities. Aoko is fiery, headstrong, and cares about others far more than she's willing to admit, and those qualities have no place in the world of magic. Mahoyo is very much a coming-of-age story for Aoko, and as her relationships with Alice and Sojuro deepen, she must reconcile with what it means to be a mage, while also staying true to who she is. This novel is unequivocally a slow-burn, character-driven story, and many of the best parts of the novel are the character moments, like their inner thoughts, their banter, or those rare moments where you see the walls come down. There is beauty in the simplicity of Mahoyo, and is such a good example of how a story doesn't always need the flashiest premise. With enough skill and finesse, strong character writing is more than enough to drive a story, and for that, Mahoyo is a masterclass in storytelling. But even though there's been a lot of focus on character writing, make no mistake, this novel has more than its fair share of spectacle. Mahoyo is easily one of the most visually impressive novels I've ever seen, and even though it originally released in 2012, it stands head and shoulders above many novels to this day. And even though the action scenes are a highlight, Mahoyo shines in the mundane ones as well, as every scene is dynamic, expressive, and unlike any novel I've read so far. Now, as a slower character-driven story, Mahoyo does take time to really get into, which means a vibe check is relevant. Chapter 1 is usually a decent checkpoint, but the story picks up around chapter 3, so it depends on what you're looking for. But thankfully, there's an even better option for most readers. Mahoyo actually has a demo available for most major platforms, and if you like what you read in the demo, you'll likely enjoy the full novel. If you've spent any time in this channel, it should be obvious how much I enjoy Nasu's works, and Mahoyo is no exception. The characters are up there with some of Type Moon's best, especially Aoko, and I love how the music does an amazing job of illustrating who each character is and what they represent. Seriously, if you listen to each character's theme and never even touch the story, the music alone tells you everything about them, from the humanity of Sojuro and Alice to the inherent duality within Aoko. Mahoyo is a delight in every sense of the word, and whether you're a Type Moon veteran or a Type Moon novice, you owe it to yourself to experience this story. But even though I praised every novel on this list, there's one novel that, to me, stands as one of the crowning jewels of the medium: The House and Fata Morgana. The story is one of an old mansion, and with a mysterious maid as our guide, what follows is a journey across time as we explore the dark, bloody, and terrifying stories that unfolded through the ages. But the mansion's storied history is only one part of the story, and as you experience tale after tale, more questions start to come to the forefront. Who is the maid? Why did she take you on this journey? And perhaps most important of all, who are you? What sets this novel apart from the average VN is how much it feels like a real, honest-to-God novel. A major inspiration for this story were the works of the late Tanith Lee, an author who specialized in sci-fi, fantasy, and horror. Lee was sadly underappreciated for most of her life, but her legacy lives on in the beautiful stories she wrote, and stories like this one, which feels exactly like the kind of story she might have written. But what's really impressive is how this VN feels like a classic novel, but one that's not afraid to experiment, creating something radically unique compared to the average gothic story. The early parts are structured like an anthology, with each part, otherwise known as doors, functioning like a separate, self-contained story. The anthology format offers a variety of different stories and settings, and a huge appeal to early doors is seeing where the maid will take you next. But even though the novel's structure is one of its more unique aspects, that structure is also a double-edged sword. By far the most common criticism of this novel is easily the pacing, as the early doors can feel slow, and readers are given little information about the overarching story. But everything does matter in one way or another, and even though each door feels self-contained, I promise you that everything will fall into place eventually. All you need is a little patience. As for the first vibe check, I'd recommend reading up to the end of Door 1. Door 1 sets the stage for the next few segments, and if you're interested by the end of Door 1, you'll likely enjoy the rest of the novel. And in addition, Door 1 gives you a basic idea of how dark the story gets. I won't go into details of course, but I will say that the novel has a disclaimer at the beginning, and I encourage you to take that very seriously before proceeding. This novel can be a lot sometimes, so it's okay if it isn't for you. And if you end up reading beyond Door 1, I highly recommend reading up to Door 4. Think of the first few doors as like a prologue, and once the real story begins, it won't be like anything else you've seen before. I'm a huge fan of gothic stories, obviously, so I think it would have been almost impossible for me to ever dislike this story, but I didn't expect to love it as much as I did. Word for word, I think it's the best written novel on this list, and not only is it one of the best visual novels I've read, it's one of the best stories I've read in a long time, and I'm not just saying that. One of my goals over the past few years was to work through the massive backlog of books I said I'd read someday, and that endeavor led me to a lot of amazing stories. But even though I got to experience some incredible stories, the house on Fata Morgana is still one I think about to this day. I was an emotional wreck after finishing this story, and every now and then, my mind drifts back to how I felt on that first read-through. It's that kind of novel. I know throughout this video, I've been recommending novel after novel, and if we're being real, I don't expect everyone to buy every novel I recommend. Reading VNs can be an expensive hobby, not to mention the time investments as well, so it's understandable to be selective with your resources. But if there's one single novel that's worth your time and money, it's this one. The novel has a phenomenal story, amazing character writing, and gorgeous visuals, and it's all brought together with a beautifully haunting soundtrack. The House on Fata Morgana is a true masterpiece, and I encourage you to experience it for yourself. But no matter where or when you decide to check out visual novels, I genuinely hope you have a blast. I know the world of VNs can feel massive and intimidating, and even though I was able to talk about a handful of novels, it's only a fraction of what the medium has to offer. There's so many other stories I wish I could talk about, but I hope you understand I had to make compromises somewhere, like limiting the recommendations, limiting the talking points, and even limiting the authors and developers in question. Trust me, there's definitely a timeline out there where this video is either thrice as long, or looks something like why you should read Type Moon novels, so I found it best to practice a little restraint. But in the end, it's impossible to explore everything visual novels have to offer, and even if you're not interested right now, I do hope you'll give them a chance someday. Breathtaking visuals, rich storytelling, sublime music, meaningful choices, all of those can be found in thousands of stories out there, and if you enjoy anything I just mentioned, then visual novels are a match made in heaven. Great stories are ones that stay with you long after the story ends, and many of my favorite VNs did exactly that. That much should have been obvious. VNs may be a niche medium, but great stories will always stand the test of time, and if you're willing to broaden your horizons, I know that someday, you'll find a visual novel that's truly special to you.